Ladies and gentlemen, it's my great pleasure to welcome you all here this evening to the Academy's New Year reception and lecture. At the start of the new year, I want to thank, on behalf of the whole Academy Council and Executive, all those who've supported the Academy's work last year. In the Academy, I'm sure we'll look back on 2008 as our first full year of residence and achievement in Carlton House Terrace. We now feel truly at home, and we hope you do as well. Our plans for the future and for this building have to take into account the recent financial realities, but we're not being deflected from the central goal that we've set ourselves to put engineering at the heart of society. Britain's engineers and scientists are now faced with the challenge to ride the storm of recession through innovation and providing solutions to improve the global economy. This building, our fellows and our friends, will be central in making that happen. I have two key functions to perform this evening, the first of which is to award the Sir Frank Whittle Medal. Now, this medal is awarded to an engineer for outstanding and sustained achievement, which has contributed considerably to the well-being of the nation. The field of activity changes annually. The award seeks to reflect the achievements and legacy of the late Sir Frank Whittle, Fellow of this Academy, famous worldwide for the invention of the jet engine. This year's medal is being awarded for engineering innovations for the environment. Now, more than ever, engineers are tasked with designing the future to combat climate change and to provide sustainable, cost-efficient solutions to safeguard the environment. I'm very pleased to announce that the winner of this year's Sir Frank Whittle Medal is Peter Head. Peter's contribution to the professions of both civil and structural engineering has been highly significant, notably in the design and construction of bridges. Peter's been the recipient of a number of prestigious awards, including an OBE in '98 for his role as government agent for the second Severn crossing, and the Academy's Silver Medal in '95 for an outstanding contribution to British industry. Since joining Arup as a director, Peter formed and now heads up their integrated planning business within the consulting group and is leading the Arup team on a project to turn Dongtang, an island 25 miles outside Shanghai, into the world's first carbon-neutral city, housing 500,000 people. The international attention this project has received has earned both Peter and Arup critical acclaim and a well-deserved reputation for innovative thinking. Peter is now widely recognized as the leading practitioner in efforts to deliver an environmentally sustainable built environment in an urbanizing world. Time magazine recently cited Peter as one of the 30 global eco-heroes that could save the planet. Peter has delivered outstanding and sustained achievement throughout his career and is well deserving of this award for engineering innovations for the environment. So, Peter, may I ask you to come up and receive the Sir Frank Whittle Medal. Now, my second task this evening is to welcome you to the Academy's New Year reception. And those of you who've been to this event in previous years will know that the occasion is intended as an opportunity for fellows, partners and special guests to meet socially and at the same time to hear an expert speak on a subject of broad interest within engineering subject matter. So tonight our speaker is, very appropriately, Peter Head. Peter's going to speak on an innovative and inspiring topic, engineering for the ecological age. And I'm now going to invite Peter to give the lecture, after which he's kindly agreed to take questions. So Peter, over to you.
Thank you all so much. It's a great honour to win this award. It means a tremendous amount to me. And I have to say, probably tonight is the highlight of my career, really. So thank you so much for coming tonight. What I'm going to do tonight is to share with you a really very broad but very detailed analysis of how I think the world could be sustained with the population growth that we're now anticipating in 2050. And this is part of what I'm presenting today is sort of feedback from going around the world talking about this subject. I've already been to the United States, I've been to Europe, I've been to the European Investment Bank in Europe, I went to the Poznan Climate Summit, I've been to India and Bangladesh and Colombo, and I'm shortly to go to other places. So what I want to do tonight is give you some feedback on that and my perceptions of what I'm hearing about around the place. After the brief introduction to the subject, I'm going to talk about the emerging vision. What is this ecological age about? What is the way we can do it? What's the framework for the transition? How can you actually go out of this room and start thinking what it really means? I want to talk about the transition in low to middle income countries, which is about a transition really still from an agricultural way of living on the planet directly to the ecological age, and missing out this rather disastrous, as we now think of it, industrial model. And then what do we do in our developed countries, in our middle to high income countries, taking our industrial model directly to the ecological age? And finally, what policy and implementation could get us there? And as I've recently been appointed as the innovation champion for Thames Gateway, I want to finish with some thoughts about how we might actually turn our attentions to a demonstrator in our own country. So first of all, here is the planet, and this very thin ecosphere that surrounds the planet is now being terribly damaged by our open source use of resources. We basically dig up non-renewable resources. We process them through our goods, our services, our televisions, our washing machines, and our built environment, and we then pollute the earth, the soil, and the water. No matter how much we like to think we're not, we are polluting it. And that is destroying this very thin atmosphere that keeps us alive. And that destruction is accelerating really quickly. And the IPCC have said now that there is now a 50% probability of a 5-degree centigrade rise in Earth's temperature by the end of this century. That means the end of civilization as we know it by the end of this century. And therefore we have to do something. And the talk tonight is about what we can do. And what underpins what I'm going to talk about is a 2-year research program in Arup looking at drivers for change and modelling the way we can live differently. And this presentation aims to answer the question, is it possible for 9.5 billion people to live sustainably on the planet in 2050? If that is the case, what policies and investments are needed to get us there? And finally, what's the role of engineering, science and technology in leading this transition? So I called my presentation Engineering the Ecological Age because I think we've got to lead. I don't think we can expect anyone else to do that. The other problem we've got, other than using non-renewable resources, is the fact that as population has grown, the amount of productive land available to support our lifestyle on the planet has diminished very dramatically. 100 years ago, we had 8 hectares of land to support everyone's life on the planet on average. We now only have 2 hectares, and we're living as if this hasn't happened. We're living in total denial. Our consumption of resources, our use of machines and other things really ignores this fundamental issue. And I believe this is one of the reasons why we've got into such difficult situation with our economy, which I'll come on to in a minute. Here are the ecological footprints in different cities around the world, and you can see here that New York, for example, has something like 8.5 hectares per person footprint, which is over 4 planets worth of resources. Houston and other spread-eagled cities in America have as much as 12 hectares per person. That's 6 planets. And typically in Europe, we're using 3 planets worth of resources. Clearly, that is unsustainable. China, on the other hand, on average, still only has about 1.5 hectares per person, which means China, on average, is still below the global Earth share of 2. So it therefore is possible for China to move to a sustainable situation of around 2 hectares per person if they adopt a different paradigm of development, which is what I'm going to come on and talk about. Now, a lot of people who write in the Financial Times every week say, wouldn't it be great if American consumers started consuming again? Well, it wouldn't be great because they're going to start consuming again at that footprint. And all that will do is accelerate our demise. It will not solve the problem, no matter what short-term economists think. So we really have to think about different models of our economy. So first of all, here's our economy growing in the last 100 years and gradually eroding and undermining the ecosystem that supports our lives. And at the moment, our economic model is if we use more non-renewable resources, GDP, therefore we're better. So if we grow GDP, everything's fine. Well, it isn't, because actually we're destroying the ecosystem. So we have to start valuing that ecosystem. And so the alternative model, which is really what I personally believe in, is what is called ecological economics, which is saying we have to use renewable resources efficiently and have a transition gradually over the next 50 to 100 years from non-renewable resources to renewable resources. We can then consume as much as we like as long as we do it efficiently. And it will be those regions and cities in the world that consume renewable resources efficiently which will be the countries and regions that have the successful economies in the future. And those that move there first, in my view, will have the most successful economies. As you all know, and a recent report has been published on peak oil, we're now consuming oil around the world at a rate which is beginning to exceed the reserves that we have available for the future. So for the first time, and of course with this fluctuating situation in the economy, the demand on oil is fluctuating, so we're fluctuating just at that peak. So we're dipping in and out of that peak, but, which is creating a dynamic fluctuation in oil price. But as soon as we start consuming again, the oil price will inexorably rise. So we've reached a point where we have to find alternatives to fossil fuels. One way of illustrating the relationship in the old industrial model between GDP and resource consumption is simply the energy we consume per person as GDP has grown. And not surprisingly, every country in the world so far has followed a linear progression where if you double GDP, you double energy consumption. We then reach a point where the EU in yellow and Japan in the purple actually level off, whereas Australia, the US and Canada have mastered the art of maximising the use of fossil fuels, mostly because of their spread-eagled cities, their spread-out, low-density cities, where car use accounts for most of that difference. China, which is the little blue line at the bottom there, China's still a relatively poor country in GDP, about $8,000 per capita. China has already got a plan to flatten that slope by 20% over the next 10 years to take it into uncharted territory on the diagram here. So coming over somewhere below Japan, which is a paradigm shift. And the only way you can do that is to have an urbanization process that breaks the link between non-renewable resource consumption and energy consumption. One of the issues in Europe, and I gave this presentation in Poland at the UN Climate Summit, and I've given this at the European Investment Bank, is that our use of structural funds in the EU should be driving us in this new paradigm direction, because the EU says we have to reduce our carbon emissions. But look what's happened in accession countries. In Spain and Ireland and Greece, ecological footprint has soared, carbon emissions have soared way beyond the targets, and this is because we're still investing in the industrial model in Europe. And there I was in the European Investment Bank confronting people and saying, why are you investing in roads in Warsaw? Every city in the world is trying to get rid of roads. Why are you doing it? And EIB is not following European policy on lowering emissions by investing in what I call the ecological age of infrastructure. So there are massive problems in the EU. We're not doing well in actually joining up all these different targets. I mentioned earlier on the reason that the US and Australia were using so much energy is because the density of their cities is so low. And this is just a simple graph that demonstrates the amount of energy you use. If you have urban densities below about 25 hectares per person, you end up having to use cars, and that means huge amounts of energy. So there is a sweet spot of urban design where you can actually get away with much lower energy and public transport becomes viable. Now, we know what that density is, and the reason that this engineer is now in planning is because the only way we can get to low-carbon living is to address the issue of density in cities, of creating great places, and of addressing planning properly. And that's why I've moved into planning, because it is the only place that we can make a difference. One opportunity, of course, if you have a higher density city, is you can start closing the roads if you provide good public transport. Because for the same number of people, if you use buses or bicycles or walk, this is the amount of road space you free up compared with using cars. That means the roads can be closed, that means that the roads can be used for development, and therefore you can create value out of that precious land in cities which is being wasted by the take-up of car use. Enough of that for the minute. I want to just describe other big problems we've got in cities around the world before I come on to the solutions. And the next big issue is that in Southern Asia and in Africa particularly, the population has already moved to cities. Urbanization is accelerating, and people have moved there without accommodation, and that's led to very high proportions of the population living in slum housing. So in Africa, we've now reached 72% of people in cities living in slums, and in Southern Asia and India, it's as much as 60%. So in addressing what is a sustainable future for societies in those places, we have to address those types of communities as well, which is what I'm going to do. Another huge problem that we cannot ignore is our inability now to supply enough food for everybody on the planet. Up until about 1985, 1990, we were using fossil fuel-based fertilizers to accelerate, continually improve productivity of our land. But about 1990, we could no longer get enough productivity out of the land to continue that. And so the amount of food we're now producing per capita is falling every week. And if the amount of food falls every week and the population continues to grow, what then happens is food prices start to shoot up. So in the last year, you all know that wheat prices have gone up 130%, and the other figures that are shown on the diagram here. And this is an intractable problem. This is not a simple economics problem. This is all to do with a supply and demand and a resource management issue. And it's a very, very difficult problem to solve unless we start growing food in different ways. So I'm going to address that too. One of the great problems of that huge price increase is if we look at this graph which shows you the proportion of money that individuals in cities spend on their food as a proportion of their income, for Bangladesh and Afghanistan on this diagram, you can see they're spending 60 to 65% of their income on food. Well, if your food prices double, that pushes you into starvation. So in cities all over the developing world, in the last year, millions of people are being pushed into starvation. And this really is not something we can stand by and let happen. We have to think about how we can address this in a long-term basis. The other big problem is that those people who are now suffering with high food prices and are living in slum conditions are those people that are most affected by flood risk and climate change in those cities as well. So we have to address adaptation. And this is just a simple graph that shows the countries most affected by climate change are the ones in green, the low and middle income countries. And those are the places where adaptation has to be addressed in parallel with development plans. And as I think you know, the mechanisms that come out of the Copenhagen Climate Summit are designed to deliver substantial funding for adaptation in the developing world. But as of Poznan, that money is just not on the table, and it's desperately needed in countries and particularly in cities to enable them to deal with the problems. So here is my summary of what I think the ecological age really means. First of all, it means a dramatic reduction in carbon dioxide emissions, an average of 50% across the world, and that means 80% in developed countries, and developing countries like India will probably still be allowed to increase their emissions maybe 15 or 20% up to around 2030. But then they will have to reduce as well up to 2050. So we're really talking about everyone living on the planet by 2050 with only 1 or 2 tons per person carbon emissions, which is a massive cultural shift. And we cannot underestimate that this isn't about technology, it is also about a massive cultural change in the world for this to come about. I also believe that we have to drive this low ecological footprint, and with 9.5 billion people, that means getting to 1.5 hectares per person. And also we have to keep the Human Development Index growing in line with the Millennium Development Goals. So my definition is achieving those 3 objectives. So how do we do it? Well, the first thing is leadership. All the studies that have been done all over the world say leadership is fundamental to this sort of level of change. And the one country in the world that has any sort of leadership around this subject is China. Because President Hu Jintao, in his speech in October 2007, said that he wants to take China towards the ecologically aware civilization, focusing on creating a resource-efficient society, developing a circular economy that uses materials in a circular way, controls emissions, increases the use of renewable resources, and also making the society ecologically aware. So recognizing that we need a massive cultural shift. So at the moment, China is the only country, but I would think that Barack Obama is now going to emerge as a champion for the same concept. And I think it is really wonderful that, I'm sure you've been listening to his speeches, he was saying last night that America could do anything. Well, I actually believe that Britain could do anything if we follow some of the ideas and principles with the talents we've got, and I'll come back to that at the end. So here is what I think is a great strategy for the ecological age, and this is using biomimicry, because those successful organisms on the planet that have been living here an awful lot longer than we have tend to follow these principles. And you've heard, I'm sure many of you have heard me talk about this before, and it's not new to the Academy. But Janine Benyus's book, Biomimicry, is a wonderful book about the subject of this transition. And in Arup, because we've been applying these principles on many, many projects now, we're beginning to realise that the term smart responsive simplicity is a very good term to get you to understand whether you're on the road to the right solution or not. If you're increasing the complexity of buildings, increasing the complexity of public transport in order to deliver what you think is the eco-age, then it's actually wrong, because actually what we need to do is collapse down the complexity that fossil fuel use has given us. One simple example is if we use quiet, clean transport in cities, so we're not belching out fumes and creating noise, we don't have to seal the envelopes of buildings, we don't have to have heavy facades, we can naturally ventilate them because we haven't got to keep the noise and pollution out. That changes the whole design paradigm for cities. So there are many ideas like that that can collapse down the problem. So I'm now going to go through what we actually do about all of this. And I thought I'd start with the developing countries and then come to countries more like our own. And so here we're talking about India, we're talking about China, we're talking about Bangladesh, we're talking about Africa. And all of the presentation here is evidence-based, so it's based on real analysis of real projects and real examples. And the sort of models I'm using are our eco-city plans in China, the brilliant development work that's been done in South America in cities like Curitiba. And one of the fundamental things we need to do is to reconnect urban and rural development resource flows. That's water, energy and waste. And I'll give you some examples. The first project I want to use as an example is the Wangzhuang Eco-City project in China, which many of you won't have heard about. And the reason I want to talk about this is that it is an eco-city project which deals with the issue of the social issues of accommodating people in new cities that are developing in China. This project is actually about not quite, a little bit more than halfway between Beijing and Tianjin, and is in a development corridor. Basically, the plan is this dotted red line area here is about 80 square kilometres, and it's got about 35 to 40 traditional rural Chinese villages in it. And the plan is to bring 200,000 people into this area and to actually create an eco-city. And basically on the left, if you can see that grid of roads, on the left is what the Chinese were going to do before we arrived on the scene, which was to wipe all the villages out, move all the villages into high-rise flats, build a grid of roads and do superblock developments between the grid, and they thought that would be a sustainable eco-city. We said that is not a sustainable city. What you should do is expand each of the villages as a mixed-use community, accommodate the peasant farmers in those villages, interconnect them with public transport, put in water, energy and waste management, using local resources, and there you've got an organic and actually exciting and livable set of places, as is shown on the right. And I'm very pleased to say that is now going to go ahead. And one of the critical issues there we discovered was that you can reconnect agriculture in the city and outside. So although you're taking some land for the city, you can actually grow food within that area, you can recycle nutrients, you can use the skills of the farmers, you can collect and recycle water to grow food in greenhouses, and so you can actually connect it all up in a different sort of way. And then I also briefly just want to show you a little short video of the Dongtang Eco-City that Lord Brown mentioned at the beginning. And really just to explain very briefly what an eco-city would mean if we were building it from scratch and not moving the population. Essentially, we're talking about villages. We're talking about developing villages within a city of around 20,000 people, of making those cities green, having open landscape and ecology in the parks, of having green roofs in order to cool the place down and enable people to live in harmony with the natural world, introducing local cultural scenes into the city, collecting and managing water and dealing with flood risk, which is very important in this particular place, leisure facilities on the water as well. Then in terms of accessibility, having a mix of uses so people can actually walk and cycle between work and school and home, and having public transport stops so you can actually walk to those to get around the place as well. And here we decided to have quiet electric and hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, so public spaces are quiet. We then have the urban infrastructure that creates all of the renewable energy to drive the city. In this case, it was a combination of combined heat and power, photovoltaic panels on the buildings, energy from waste plants, and large-scale windmills on the site. And finally, from the buildings point of view, designing the buildings to consume about 70% less energy than traditional buildings, which is now perfectly possible, and thereby being able to run the city entirely on renewable energy. So that's the plan for Dongtang. In India, as I've said earlier on, we have a situation where people have already moved to these cities, so it's not like China where it's more controlled, and therefore you've got this situation. And here is a quote from the current Prime Minister that people have the right for economic and social development to discard the ignominy of widespread poverty. And so what I want to share with you is the approach that we think is appropriate in these types of informal settlements. Just now not working. Okay, so I'm not going to show that. Unfortunately, for some reason it's got disconnected, but I'll maybe come back and show it at the end. Having talked about developing countries, I now want to talk about a transition from the industrial to the ecological age. So now we're moving from developing countries to here and to America, and how do we actually make this important transition? So here we're talking about retrofitting our existing cities and at the same time reconnecting our urban and rural resource management. And here the evidence base for this is the very innovative London Climate Change Action Plan that was developed under Ken Livingstone's regime, but also examples in Europe like the retrofitting of Freiburg, Malmo, Stockholm, and one city that's a really outstanding North American city is Vancouver, where actually walkable communities are being built right in the centre of Vancouver. So there are many examples that prove that this can be done. The London Climate Change Action Plan is still being taken forward by Boris Johnson. He still is saying he will implement it. And what this does basically is to say we are going to take London's carbon emissions from where we are today. This was a couple of years ago, so we're a bit further on that graph. And one of the things that really scares me about this graph is that by 2012, 2013, which is when we have the London Olympics in London, we are planning to actually have a dramatic reduction of carbon emissions down that red line, to have a 60% reduction by 2025 and an 80% reduction by 2050. And that's the sort of area under the curve that we've got to achieve to deliver the IPCC recommendations. Well, to be honest, we're not anywhere in delivering that rate of change by about 2013. So the really scary message I want to leave with you is we're just not doing this fast enough. We've got to get on with it, because the preparations that you need to have that scale of change are just not being made fast enough. To give you one example of what it means in commercial buildings, which are currently in a certain amount of difficulty in relation to development and capital, one opportunity we have is to retrofit our current commercial buildings, and the plan says that about half of the reduction in emissions associated with commercial buildings could be done by a more efficient supply of heat and electricity, part of which will be changing the supply grid to have more renewables, but another part will be putting local energy and heat supply grids into the city, as the LDA are planning to do. Changing the physical infrastructure of buildings, making them better insulated and so on, is another 20% of the 80% reduction. Behavioural change is another 25% of the total. But new buildings built in London over the period between now and 2050 are only going to make 5% of the difference between where we are now and an 80% reduction. So don't imagine that specifications of new build are really going to make a great deal of difference. It's all about retrofitting our existing structures. And the great opportunity is to pull in pension and sovereign wealth funding into that activity, because you can get a guaranteed return on the on the revenue savings from making these big reductions. So actually, by retrofitting, you can pull in new sources of financing. Along with retrofitting buildings, we need to invest surgically in changing our transport infrastructure. Very topically now, number one is talking about between city centres. The evidence now is very clear. For city centres that are 600 to 800 kilometres apart, we know from Europe and Japan that high-speed rail connecting those city centres is preferable to travellers, as long as those high-speed railways go through the international airports. It's not good enough just to take them city centre to city centre, because if people take an international flight, which at the moment we have no solution for in terms of carbon emissions, they will get on another flight unless the train is available at the airport. So in terms of this big reduction in emissions, taking high-speed rail through airports is fundamental, which is why Arup is promoting the Heathrow hub idea at Heathrow. Then we have to change our mass transport in cities. That's the London Underground, the overground railways have to run on renewable energy. And we could do that straight away. A decision could be taken to take renewable energy supplies into those situations. I tried to persuade the UK government to run the whole railway system on renewable energy about 10 years ago, and said this will be a great way of securing the supply or the demand for renewables that would enable the wind wheels to be built all around the UK, because actually it matches. It's about 12% of our consumption, but that hasn't happened. So changing our mass transport to use renewables is a quick win that we could do. And finally, we've discovered through Dongtang that putting consolidations for freight delivery in cities using green vehicle fleets to go from those consolidations into the city in an organised way saves a massive amount of energy, and of course also can lead to renewables. And some companies like Tesco's are already starting to do this. So high-speed railways, electric transit in cities running on renewables, and electric vehicles, which increasingly we understand will not require massive increases in electrical supply, because you can draw down the electricity at night when there's less demand. So the efficiency of the whole supply network gets increased if you use electric vehicles. Now moving on to energy infrastructure, which I know interests a lot of you here. And there's no doubt that in Europe, if we move to large-scale renewable energy from wind, waves, tidal streams, hydro, we can actually run Europe on renewable energy, particularly if we took the concentrated solar power from North Africa and all of those other opportunities. It is possible to do that using smart grids. You would have to store energy, possibly using hydrogen, which can then become a fuel for transport. And I do see nuclear as a transition technology at the very least to get us from where we are to where we need to be. So coming back to cities, decentralised renewable energy and power in cities is really important to improve efficiency and to use waste heat in a more efficient way. And that leads to local heating and cooling microgrids, which actually reduce the amount of losses. And then the final issue, which of course we all know, is that carbon sequestration at existing power stations has to be part of this solution, otherwise we're not going to get there. So on carbon sequestration, ARUP have done a study over the last 2 or 3 years, and we've concluded that we think that the only viable solution for this is going to come from collecting carbon dioxide into algae bioreactors, where the algae actually is used in very large concrete vessels to absorb carbon dioxide, so the algae can then be used as a valuable material for various opportunities within the city. And the big opportunity is to take the algae through anaerobic digesters, where you can get some energy back out that you put in through lighting in the vessels, but also you can then return the carbon to the land in the compost that comes out at the end. So actually it is a possible technology for turning coal back into carbon that you can put it back into the land. We really do believe that this could be an exciting opportunity, and research is going on in the UK on it. And then the really important issue that I think is a massive opportunity for engineering and manufacturing in the UK is the issue of resource management for the ecological age. We have to get away from using non-renewable resources in all the products and systems to using renewable ones. One way of doing that in terms of current waste management is that all our organic waste can go through anaerobic digesters to create energy and compost, and we think that technology is really, really important. We need to capture water and recycle it, and that is an area where the UK is really awful compared with everywhere else in the world. We really have got to change the way we think about water management, because we're paying a lot for our water and we're using a lot of energy in managing it unnecessarily. Thirdly, we can get nutrients for food production back out of the waste stream from our sewage and our other waste. And we can then start growing food on rooftops and in buildings in cities using captured and recycled water, using renewable energy and using nutrients from the waste stream. And this isn't pie in the sky, this is being done in America. And finally, we have to recognise that we need to start mining materials from our existing industrial age rather than using non-renewables. So in a sense, we're looking forward to a society where we recover and reuse and recycle and remanufacture products. And I really do think, I've been all over the world talking about this, and there still isn't any country in the world that has brought together product design, engineering, manufacturing to say, why don't we create a design for reuse and remanufacturing culture and bring companies here that want to do that and use our world-class product design and engineering skills to change the whole product paradigm. And then in our buildings, we have to design them so at the end of their life, they can be recycled, components can be reconditioned, systems can be reused, and buildings refurbished so they're more flexible. And this is something we should be doing right now in all the buildings we're designing, but I'm afraid to say we're not at the moment doing this very effectively. I wanted to briefly mention Japan, because many of you may not know that Japan has national targets for a sound material cycle society. So between 2000 and 2010, Japan has embarked on a resource productivity transition of a 40% reduction in GDP per input of natural resources. And they have almost achieved it now. They're actually a year ahead. And they've got change, recycle, reuse rates and disposal of waste targets are being reached too. But this is for the whole of Japanese society. So it seems to me, having set these targets, it isn't surprising that Hitachi bullet trains are going to be ploughing up and down CTRL, that we've got streets full of Toyota hybrid cars, because it comes directly out of national policy, because this is actually something that Japan wanted to do for itself. And therefore, I think national policy is really important. I mentioned earlier about growing food in cities. There are many projects going on around the world, which I'm going to illustrate in a video, hopefully in a minute. And finally, before I go on to showing you what this looks like, I just want to make the point that in my list of ecological age transition ideas, one of them is running on information. And one of the quickest and simplest ways of getting this cultural transition and getting people to live in a more sustainable way is to give people the real-time information to enable them to make those decisions. And that is something that could be a very quick win and a quick fix for projects like Thames Gateway, for example, and I hope that we'll take advantage of that. So here I'm going to show an example of retrofitting, first of all, the downtown area of a city, and this happens to be Manchester. So this is actually how this all might work out in Manchester city centre. So first of all, we imagine that the high-speed rail has already arrived at Manchester Piccadilly, and a much more widespread tram system is available. So those hubs, those transport hubs, are ideal places for higher density mixed-use development to take place. So as the trams are brought into the city, and we're thinking about adapting for climate change, we can put in extra trees into the city to cool it down, to cool the streets. And we can also start collecting and gathering and use energy efficiently on the sides of buildings by growing algae, perhaps, in algae screens on the side of buildings, by growing plants up the side of buildings. This has been done in Paris recently, as I'm sure you know, cooling the streets and making them more attractive. Putting photovoltaic panels on the sides of buildings as well as the top, because they'll be cheap enough to be able to do that. And growing food on the tops of buildings. And where you see greenhouses, Arup sees nighttime cooling in the summer in Manchester, as well as growing food. And this is a really exciting commercial opportunity. So overall across the city, we begin to see a new pattern of using the city and living in harmony with the natural world. Going to work, you can look up when the bus is coming on your PDA, so you can arrive just at the bus stop as the bus arrives, rather than having to look at what the information on the screens there. And maybe those building owners that actually are very proud of their energy consumption might be displaying it on the side of their buildings to show what a great job they're doing to all their peers in the city. So we're talking about a transformation of a city which is a practical, deliverable, economic transition to living more in harmony with the natural world. So you may be thinking, sitting there, what on earth do we do about American suburbs? So hopefully I'm now going to show you what we would do in an American suburb. And this is probably one of the world's greatest challenges. So here are our suburban houses, very low density, which can be retrofitted with photovoltaic panels, with natural ventilation systems. And one of the reasons we can do that is the streets have been quietened down because we've now got quiet public transport and people are walking and cycling more. So first of all, reducing energy demand in the existing buildings is really important. And then the second phase of this is to change the nature of the streets and the way land is used. If people don't need to use cars anymore, the garage can be converted into a grocery store. We're using food grown in the front of the house and around the back of the house, and the whole situation for local people starts to begin to change. There are jobs created, water is captured and used for growing food. And then the third element of this is the community benefits, the social benefits. Here is another garage that's converted into enabling one to invite one's elderly parents to live with you. And the elderly parents can then look after the children. There are more people around during the day. There's a greater mix of ages within the community. And the walking and cycling routes are available for that purpose, which they're not at the moment. So greater socio-economic diversity is possible with this model. And then, of course, the 4x4s and all the big vehicles can disappear. We can have public transport on the left of the street. We can have charging points for electric car clubs on the right hand of the street. And people can start travelling around with very low carbon and using a range of different facilities. And then finally, all sorts of technologies are now coming along for waste management, for collecting energy from this huge area of tarmac in cities like this. We can start putting down different materials that collect and absorb energy. One can put in waste collection systems under the street. One can put in the cycling routes. One can start growing food. And one of the great opportunities from the tree planting and food growing is to increase biodiversity. And that, of course, is another wonderful element of this new paradigm of living in suburbs in America. So going from that street level up to the planning level, of course, what does this mean in planning an area of a city? Basically what it means is, in America you have a grid of roads, so essentially what you're going to do is to take some of that grid, start running bus services along that grid. At the intersection points then one can have smart information technology to provide information. You can then put dense mixed-use developments around those transport node connections, those interventions, to actually increase the population density. You can then put in connections with the rail and other public transport more widely. You can put in green routes through the city. You can put in food-growing areas and renewable energy within the city. And when you look at all of that, you can change the paradigm of urban development without reconstructing the whole area. So here is just a simple collection of ideas that I've mentioned earlier on, which I call the infrastructure investments for the ecological age. So finally, about policy and implementation. And here I mention stimulus packages, because we are at this amazing moment when all seems lost, but actually there's everything to gain, because the public sector is now empowered to actually manage economic investment, particularly through banks, very well. I thought it was very interesting on the Today programme today, talking about ensuring the risks associated with investment. Well, one of the best ways of ensuring investment is to get those investments in the right things for the future and not be investing in other things. And pension funds have been very good at guiding investment. And so I think we need guidance and I think the Royal Academy could play a role here in helping the investment community to understand that these are the things we need to be investing this money in to safeguard our future and to get a return on it. And so for national government, we need to make sure that policies are coming forward. It's not good enough. I mean, it's great that we've got a law for low carbon living, but we've got to have policies that drive it by valuing the natural capital we're destroying in order to change our policy environment. We need to make sure we have a fair distribution of resources within communities, and I've tried to explain some of the mechanisms for doing that in the presentation. And finally, we need to have policies that drive efficiency in using renewables. And the energy feed-in legislation is an ideal example of how that could be done. That will be a brilliant way of using public sector money, I think, to drive this transition effectively. So there are many other examples around the world. In terms of changing quickly enough, I don't think it's going to be good enough to do this at an individual building or house level. I think we're going to need retrofitting at a regional level in cities, probably a population of around 100,000 people. So when you remember the cable teams coming down your road to put cables in, or if you're old enough to remember the gas transition from town gas to natural gas, that sort of process of change needs to happen in every street, in every city, in every developed country in the world. A massive challenge, but it is a possible investment for pension and sovereign wealth funds because you can securitize the financial savings you get from that dramatic reduction in resource consumption. And there are many models emerging for that around the world, particularly in San Francisco, where the CalPERS pension fund is investing in public building retrofit exactly for that reason, and they reckon that those investments are some of the best investments they've ever found for pension funds. Finally, before I finish, I just want to not give the impression that we know everything about this subject, because we know very little about it, and therefore it is most important that the research community are engaged properly in everything we do, every investment we make down this road. We need to research properly. We're only going to get one shot at changing direction, and therefore putting in place the scale of research that we really need to ensure we have an evidence base for policy making to drive us in this direction is critical. So ARUP's working very hard to establish research centres for this sustainability integrated approach in cities. We've got one established with government support in Thames Gateway now, called the Thames Gateway Institute for Sustainability. We're hopefully going to have one in Dongtang in China that's twinned with that. We're talking to the Macquarie Institute in Uganda about having one for Africa, particularly sub-Saharan Africa. We're actively talking about having one in Melbourne, and following my presentations in North America, there's a lot of interest there in having one as well. So we think global research coordination is really important. And finally, as I said at the beginning, I just want to focus our minds on what we might do next, the group of us actually listening today. The government has announced that the Thames Gateway is to be our first eco-region, and if you read the prospectus, you will find it follows many of the ideas that I've put forward here. We have world-class design skills, many of them in this room. We have world-class financing skills. We have world-class technological skills. We have world-class transport, world-class rail, a new port, world-class airports connected to this region. We have world-class skills. There is nothing to stop us going as we did in the Industrial Revolution and really demonstrating that we can develop our own ecological age approach, and we have all the conditions available to us right now, but it needs real leadership. And I don't think we're going to get that leadership from the politicians, because according to Michael Heseltine and John Prescott at a recent meeting we had in the House of Commons, they said that it's not possible for politicians to be leaders in this really good sense, because you get shot at by the media. It's a really big problem that we have in our society. So I think we need leadership from engineers and the technical community to really move this forward, and everyone is asking for that at the moment. So I think genuinely we now understand that the ecological age is probably the only way we're going to be able to live on the planet successfully. This is a rather brutal comparison between Los Angeles and the Dongtang model, but nevertheless it does prove a point that I was brought up on the Blade Runner films. I'm worried when I was young that might be, I didn't really fancy living in a place like that. It was fun to watch on a film. So the Blade Runner image of cities is not the future of living on the planet. The future of living on the planet is living in harmony with the natural world, bringing natural processes into cities and living much more simple lifestyles in cities, efficiently using renewables, but living in a much lighter way on the planet. I genuinely believe that the UK still has the chance to be a leader in this, but there's not much time left. Within the next 5 years, we have to make real progress right across our industrial manufacturing and technological base to move in this direction. And I hope the Royal Academy will be a leader in pulling all the other institutes and organisations together with the economists and with the financial institutions to say we're not going to stand around watching other countries lead in this. We're going to lead ourselves. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, the floor is now yours to ask Peter questions or make statements, and I'd be happy to. Sir, in the middle, there's going to be a microphone. A microphone.
Sorry, microphone. Yeah. If we accept that the Clinton City Initiative has taken root in many of the cities of the world, with all the objectives you're talking about, can we assume, therefore, that your proposals mesh with theirs? And if they don't mesh, what happens?
Thanks. Yeah, the Clinton Climate Initiative, for those that don't know about it, was actually created by London. The Mayor of London decided that one of the best ways of getting London to be a world-class leader in low-carbon cities was to partner with others and not try and do it all ourselves. So created a club called the C40 Club of Cities, which grew very quickly. And they then thought they needed a delivery partner, so they actually procured the Clinton Climate Initiative to support them. And the Clinton Climate Initiative is a sort of fundraising facilitator for action in cities, and is very active, as I mentioned, in getting deals going with pension funds, for example, for public building retrofit. So actually it's entirely consistent with London's approach. Indeed, many of the principles being used are the ones adopted by London. And the opportunity is there for the Clinton Climate Initiative to work with London and work with the public sector and so on here as well. But they are all totally joined up at the moment. But of course, some of the energy that London was putting in here has somewhat deflated, and the energy now has moved to Toronto. The Mayor of Toronto, Mayor Miller, is now actually leading the C40 group and is very much leading from the point of view of Toronto as well as the rest of the world.
Thank you. Question? Sir, Ian Ritchie. The microphone's coming that way.
Thank you very much, Peter. One question. In your Brunel lecture, you had a footnote. James Hansen, the director of the Goddard Space Studies Institute at Columbia, indicated quite clearly from their knowledge that the parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere, if we go by what you suggested on your graph, 450, or Stern at 500, we've actually got a major problem, a very, very big problem. And that CO2 coming out of coal-fired power plants is perhaps the closure we need to see.
Yes.
Can you comment?
Yeah, I agree. I think the problem with this subject is that, as some of you will know, that the concerns about the problem are growing all the time. So actually a lot of the material we're using is constantly out of date. So actually the concern that everyone is having is growing all the time. So as you've said, we're now thinking about, 450 is not good enough, 400 maybe, even 350. And one of the big issues is no matter what we achieve by 2050, we've got to get back to 350 eventually, because otherwise we'll be overwhelmed by sea level rise, which over several hundred years, if we remain at those very high levels, will actually overwhelm us anyway. So there are all sorts of issues like that. So yes, you're right. I mean, it is a great concern. The other issue that came out of Poznan, which you may not have got out of the press, is, of course, the NGO community, and some of you here are working with the NGO community around the world. Even if we limit a temperature rise to 2 degrees, which seems now pretty unlikely, the impact of a 2-degree rise on the developing world and communities living in these slum conditions in cities is quite horrific. I mean, the NGO community are aware of how horrific that's going to be. And in Poznan, they were very actively saying to the negotiators, you're not even successfully negotiating our way to 2 degrees, but do you realize how severe 2 degrees is going to be on communities around the world? It is terrible, absolutely awful. And even that is now unlikely to be achieved. So it is a fairly desperate situation, really.
Peter, let me ask you a question. I think there are so many people in the academy, and I count myself as one of them, who've been working in this area for a long time. And every time we come up with a point of decision, people recoil from the decision. Either it is because events happen, so a recession, or it's because people question the fundamentals in a sufficient way to cast doubt on in the decision makers' minds. You said we need to get on, and I completely agree. We need to get on and get things done, and we need leadership, and we don't have that. So the question is, what would you do? What would you do? What were the couple of things that, if you could wake up tomorrow morning and say, these will be done, what would they be?
Well, I think the first thing that we should, as a profession, we should declare a state of war against climate change. I think we should put our whole profession on a sort of war footing. I was very taken with the Chinese response to the earthquake in Sichuan, where they did that. They actually mobilized a tremendous amount of resources from all over China to go and deal with the problem. Japan did the same thing after the Kobe earthquake. So there is precedent for technologists really getting up and dealing with the problem. I think we need to say to everyone, look, this is so serious now that we need to have a mobilization of our resources and work out how to coordinate it and actually set up a sort of wartime environment where people start thinking differently about all of our resources. One of the things a very simple thing we've been saying is that we need to use all of this land. We're in the middle of a terrible recession. An awful lot of land that was going to be developed is not now going to be developed. Why aren't we growing food on it? Why aren't we setting up greenhouses, capturing water, using renewable energy to grow food in cities all over the UK? And we could do that and make money out of it. It's not as if it would be a no-win game. We should be retrofitting all of our buildings now using pension fund money and other money that we know is there and available. So actually there are things we could do immediately like that. Deals could be done, action could be taken, jobs could be created. But obviously there's a longer term perspective to that, which I won't try and outline. But I do think that maybe is what's necessary, that if we really, I think we all believe this, and why don't we do that? Why don't we say this is now so serious that we as a community, as a profession, think that we should declare some sort of change of approach? I don't know.
So,
Rick Parker, Rolls-Royce. I was going to ask a different question, but I'll just pick up on that last point. It's interesting to reflect that the Hoover Dam and the Tennessee Valley system would not be there if it wasn't for the 30s recession. So recessions are quite a good time to persuade governments to invest in energy projects. The point I was going to make, you paint a hugely compelling and terrifically exciting picture, but it's vitally important that this is done as a coherent whole and that people don't just latch the bit that fits their particular ideology. And to pick an example of that, which is very topical this week, you said about flying short distances and going by train instead. If you do that in the UK today with our train usage, our load factors on trains, and our source of energy and the transmissions losses in our electrical systems, you'll actually produce more CO2 going by train than you would by flying. So we have to tackle it as a whole, yes, and not just go for soundbite solutions to problems.
No, I entirely agree with you. So the idea of having a high-speed rail network has to be associated with appropriate renewable energy supplies, which supply at the right level of efficiency. And I entirely agree with you. So what I'm trying to present here is a holistic picture. It's not a shopping list of some things you can do and some things you shouldn't do. It's a holistic approach to the problem. And it does. You know, we've been through the numbers, and it is possible, and it will deliver the outcomes. But you have to have smart grids, and you have to have all sorts of things that contribute to it. But it is doable. What we wanted to do is to try and paint a picture to say, actually, it is doable. You know, there is a place to go to that works. Because at the moment, you know, people are not convinced that there is a place to go to, and then, of course, you don't do anything.
There's a question in the other room.
Bill O'Riordan. Absolutely enjoyable. In fact, great for the grandchildren.
Got a microphone?
But I look at the picture on the wall and I think to myself, well, is it doable? Pardon? Sorry?
Go ahead and...
Oh, you can't hear me in there. Sorry. I have to come out here, sorry.
Great.
Where is it? Sorry, I've just looked at the picture on the wall, and what really intensely worries me is if I look at the top picture and the bottom picture about doability, every square meter of Los Angeles is owned by somebody. And they don't want to sell it, they don't want to change it, they don't want to move it. And whilst we all have these grandiose plans about change and what's good for the environment, how the hell do we deal with the transition between ownership on top, because we all want to feel we own our own land, and the bottom, which is for the common good?
Right.
It's very much like, I think what Mandelson said is, 3 soldiers died in Iraq or in Afghanistan last week. At the same breath he said, well, you people near Heathrow, I think you should give up your land for the common good. They did, and I totally agree with Mandelson, yeah. What I'm really saying to you is this is great for the construction industry. It's really lousy for the people who have got capital and invested funds at the moment.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because actually it's completely the opposite, in fact. I mean, we're actually working in Los Angeles. We're actually working in the city on real projects which are affecting the transition. And the great thing about it is that people value the natural world. They value being close to a park. They value having good access to public services. And they value being able to get access to work without having to sit in traffic jams. So actually, Los Angeles is being transformed slowly, yet, by actually taking some blocks and converting them into mixed-use communities, which is being done commercially and attractively. Opening up of the river in Los Angeles, which is not, it's a culvert under the ground, you wouldn't know it was there, but by opening it up and actually creating greenery around it, you create land value and value uplift that is actually funding the projects. So actually, all the evidence from around the world is that investment, there are people here who know better than this than I do, that investment in mixed-use developments gets a higher return on capital than single-use developments, and so on and so forth. Introducing parks and green spaces increases value, and so on. So actually these things are doable commercially and from a self-interest point of view, as well as from another point of view.
Dash, totally agree with you, but one last point is they're great in microcosms, but to take it to the next level to a macrocosm, it's almost impossible. I'm not saying that should be a showstopper, but I think you should pause a little, because everything you propose is about new concrete and about new infrastructure, and the biggest contributor to sort of our problem today is actually making concrete.
Well, I did make the point that you have to have, and you're quite right, because unless we have low ecological footprint as the target for every project that's done, then it doesn't work. But the Dongtang Eco-City, for example, is aiming to have an ecological footprint close to the global Earth share. It's about 2.5 hectares per person. So constructing that city does arrive at a place that actually enables you to use resources in the right way. So what I'm saying to you is it is possible to do this because you can recycle materials, you can use other types of materials, and you can use cement that's created using renewable energy and so on and so forth. All of these things are possible, but you're right, it is a massive cultural shift, a massive technological shift.
Thank you very much, and I still think that Arup is one of the most successful British companies we have, and you should be congratulated. Thank you.
Thank you. There's another question next door, I think, as well.
Yeah, I'll come in here, Alec Brewers. We're in the colonies there, so we quite like looking at our pictures in a slightly different way. A marvellous lecture, just an observation about what's important. And Los Angeles brings it to me because it was Los Angeles that solved the last pollution problem very rapidly. It was California that taught us how to clean up cars, not London or Paris or anybody else. And they did a quite amazing job at doing that. The problem at the moment is that the bulk of America is not convinced of the case. And I would make that observation. I've just come back from 3 weeks. I spend about 3 months a year there now. And the trouble is that America's had some quite cold winters. And the problem is education there. If we could educate the Americans, if they could be better persuaded, because they haven't seen it around them, they have fantastic resource, fantastic innovation ability. So I think we've got far more to do with education before we can really pull these things off. That's just an observation, but yours is a most convincing case. If we could get you to talk to them, all of them, we mightn't have the problem. We mightn't have the problem.
No, I agree with you, Alec, and there are some great examples of what you've just said. San Francisco, which has completely transformed its waste management, literally in about 2 years, is now one of the leading countries in recycling waste from nowhere. And they started with education programs in the local primary schools, and they created a lot of cartoon characters, and they created a real sort of energy amongst young people. And what I've been told is that those young people went home, they engaged with their grandparents and put a squeeze on their parents from grandparents and from the youngsters. And there's a lot of evidence around the world that the engagement between young children and their grandparents is able to change generation X and Y in terms of their attitudes much more quickly. But you're quite right, education is really important. China's recognised that too. Everywhere you go, Curitiba was the same. They used education to drive change. But I think the point that I'm saying is by doing demonstrators and education, you know, there's a great charity which is now creating these super homes around the UK where individuals are transforming their homes, and they're either being bought by local authorities or are being opened to the public. But either way, you can actually go to a super home that's quite like your own home and see how it's been transformed to reduce its energy consumption. So actually education can be done through demonstrators, and that's what I think we should do, not just do it theoretically, but actually demonstrate it on the ground.
Thank you. So,
thank you, Peter.
we wait for a microphone just there.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter. Inspiring lecture. I hope not to inject a sour note, but I want to pick up on exactly what you've just said. I'm at the University of Surrey, which is in Guildford. Guildford is twinned with Freiburg. I share your enthusiasm for Freiburg. I have yet ever to get a member of Guildford Council to address the question, why is Freiburg so much nicer than Guildford? I fear that demonstration is not enough. Now, I don't know, I don't have an answer to this, but I mean, one of the things that strikes me is that you are talking here about possible futures, not speculative futures. We know that we could do this, and the barriers are not indeed in the technology. I have my doubts as to whether mere demonstration, taking members of Guildford Council to Freiburg, for example, will be enough, because it hasn't been so far. But I'm stuck for what else to do, and if you've got any suggestions, that will be great.
Well, I suppose the first one is to do some demonstrators in the Thames Gateway, which is now government policy, RDA policy, everyone else policy to actually do it, and communities are really interested too. So I have a feeling your Guildford people might just about get themselves to Thames Gateway, maybe, to actually...
Guildford is not like that.
No, indeed. No, I can understand that. But your point is very well made. I'm not pretending any of this culturally is really is really easy. But I think everyone's got to be scared. You know, I think genuinely we've got to get to a situation where people are scared enough to be motivated to do it. And there is a great history of human civilization that we don't seem to be capable of being scared enough early enough to prevent collapse of civilizations. It's happened time and time again. And if you don't mind me just making a point, I was at the New York Science Festival last July. I was on a platform with 3 Nobel laureates. One was a neuroscientist, one was an astrophysicist, and one was a nanotechnologist. And each of them was talking about what achievements have been made in the last 100 years in their subjects. And they each said that we've pretty much gone from not a lot of knowledge to a huge amount of knowledge in terms of the universe, in terms of atoms and molecules, in terms of brains. Then I stood up and said, in the last 100 years, you know, we've completely messed up the way we live on the planet. And how is it that we've been able to be brilliant at one thing and awful at another? And I think your point is well made. A lot of it's to do with this cultural problem that we don't understand resource limits and resource management and consumption.
Yes. Thank you. Peter, the contrast between the present and the future that you postulated is enormous. But you have not required us to invent anything new. You made very few claims about a science that we don't have or an engineering that we don't have. So it seems to me that the engineers can do their bit, that it's a social issue rather than maybe an economic one as well, rather than a technology issue. Now, do you think the social experts can come up alongside, or are the engineers just going to have to sort of lengthen their arms and encompass another whole set of skills?
No, that's a very good question. I mean, there is evidence that they can. It varies from place to place, but I think, you know, in a way, we've got to go and explore that. I think, you know, we shouldn't sit and worry about that. We should go and literally go and look for the arms to join and to work together. I think working in communities is really, really important. I would start at the community level and really engage communities in getting involved in partnerships with the public and private sector to actually drive change and to really get excited about change. I think it's better done at that level and with schools than it is in the sort of theoretical behaviour change environment. I think it's better to get right down to the nitty-gritty in communities, which in the end is where the change has got to happen. And I think that's probably what I would do, is start there. And as some of you know, I'm a director of groundwork in London for that very reason, because I like to get involved in my spare time and in getting involved in communities, and how difficult it is, but how exciting it is when you get it right, to get communities excited about changing their own conditions. And that's where I would think I would affect that joining of hands.
Sam.
I was very interested in the ecological future that you put forward. The thing that worries me is that over the next 20 to 30 years, to bring these changes about, enormous amount of energy has to be put into making the change. Yeah. Surely part of the decision-taking has to be involved with the total energy life cycle. We are wasting so much energy in mass production and designed obsolescence. Yeah. And the same thing could happen with all the changes which you're proposing which should be made. The amount of energy involved is going to be enormous.
Well, as I said earlier, the transition, the construction side of it is taken account of by aiming for low footprint, and therefore mining cities, mining materials, and using construction methods that have a much lower carbon intensity is okay. And actually, in the calculation, you can divide the effort you put into the construction side by the life cycle of that system. So actually, you don't have to take it all now. It can be spread out in terms of its impact on the planet over a period of 50 years. You know, we've still got 40 years to go up to 2050, so you can spread the impact out over that period of time. But the energy consumption in the operational end of it is so dominant in our, as you say, in our wasteful society, that actually by making a big reduction in that, you can still afford to do the construction bit. And that's really the message I'm giving you, that actually it is possible to achieve a very low footprint as long as we recycle and reuse materials, and as long as our products and systems and our washing machines and our hi-fis and our mobile phones are remanufactured and reused products and are not products that are using raw materials. That actually is just as important. It's almost as much of an impact, actually, as our living in cities, in buildings and roads. So the two things have to go hand in hand. But as Lord Bhattacharya said in the Times this weekend, you know, there's a great opportunity for British engineers and mechanical engineers and technologists to get involved in the remanufacturing, redesign area, as well as the buildings and roads and infrastructure. And that's an area really which I think is a tremendous opportunity here and isn't really being grasped anywhere else at the moment.
Recycling uses, in many cases, as much energy as making from new materials.
Yeah, but if you're using...
This is fatal. When you consider that now to get copper out of the Zambian mines, they're down to 0.25% of copper.
Yes, no, I know.
99.75% is overburden. The amount of energy involved.
No, I agree with you.
To get that 0.25%, which we then distribute so
no, I agree with you.
thinly over the surface of the earth that it's irrecoverable.
No, I entirely agree with you. And of course, the largest copper mine in the world is now New York City. So
Yes.
really what I'm saying is we've got to have that attitude. You know, we've got to say, you know, this is the only way we're going to go forward, is to mine copper out of our existing cities.
Peter, there are two hands up. I'm going to ask you for a very short question and a very short answer.
Fine. Okay.
Scott.
Thank you. The headline in the Metro newspaper the other day read that an Englishman's home is his castle. And the judge was talking about burglary, but of course he could have been talking about retrofit. At a meeting in the city just the other day, they were saying that in Germany they don't have this problem, the problem that Mike Kelly is working with. How do we get into people's homes in England, as you do with an MOT on your car? In Germany, every home is inspected every year, and you are penalised on your electricity bill if it is not compliant. And your home, moreover, is marked down by 50,000 euros in the title deeds until it is retrofitted. Do you see European legislation reaching an Englishman's castle?
Well, I think in the end it has to. I mean, if you take the London, I'm going to give you a slightly longer answer, but if you take the London example, we started a system of providing loans for people to retrofit their homes, and that was for insulation in their loft. And there was almost no take-up of that at all. And when we actually examined why that was, we discovered that people just couldn't be bothered to take all the stuff out of the loft, to take it out so people could do the work and then put it back again. So actually that program's now been changed, and the new program is now to do all of that. You know, we'll come in, we'll take all the stuff out, we'll do that and put it all back again. So you're absolutely right. But actually I think there is a sign that people will be willing to allow people to come and do this sort of thing if it gives them a benefit, as long as everybody does everything and they're quick and they're efficient and they don't make a mess.
Sir, last question.
Thanks again, Peter, for a super lecture. You made a passing reference to nuclear power, nuclear energy in your presentation. I'm just wondering how you see it fitting into the whole context of your theme and the development for the future.
Yeah, I made passing references to so many things, but I do think nuclear is really important to enable us to maintain energy security through the next 30 to 40 years. But of course, nuclear is not a renewable resource. It's a non-renewable resource, and we will get to a stage eventually when uranium prices perhaps get so expensive at the very least that it begins to be not such an attractive option. So looking really long haul, you know, at an ecological age future, I'm sure that nuclear eventually will be superseded by renewable resources when we've figured out how to do that really effectively. But so I do see nuclear as a sort of transition technology in my brain, thinking about very long-term thinking. But clearly it's going to be very important to us to maintain a nuclear capacity to enable our energy security to be maintained until we've built up our supplies of renewable energy. And of course, within Europe as a whole, if the idea of having a renewable grid eventually in Europe comes about, nuclear will be a big part of that grid until eventually renewables takes over.
Peter, thank you very much. I'm almost sad that I'm chairing this lecture rather than actually commenting on it. But I think, first I'd like to thank you. I think your lecture is part of the package of things we need for leadership. Inspiring and clear, so thank you very much for that. Secondly, I think you can be assured that the Academy, after a slow start in this area, is very much concerned with doing what we can, both as part of the leadership and the delivery, to get carbon out of our society and get on to the future. My third point is one which is this, that we've talked a lot this evening about what we can do in the UK, and the examples are in the developed world. But of course, by 2020, we probably need to take about 30% of the carbon out of our system against business as usual. But only a third of that is going to come from the developed world. Fully 2/3 will come from the developing world, and the cost of doing that per year will be bigger than the entire overseas development aid budgets of the world presently. So the challenge is for us, I believe, to lead, but we have to do that quite quickly, because actually the action is going to be elsewhere. Ladies and gentlemen, we should thank Peter, and then we should go and have a drink and dinner next door. Thank you for coming. Peter, thank you.